So these three these three fundamental tenets of evolutionary enlightenment, clarity of intention, power of volition, and face everything, avoid nothing, are basically about soul development, which I think is the most important part of spiritual development. You can have penetrating insights and realize the significance of big new ideas, but if you're not going to take them on board, it just passes through you. So the liberating insight, so you can say, I've seen the truth, but did it stick? Does it stick? Is there fertile soil that the truth you've realized is going to stick? And then you've been exposed to big ideas that you recognize, are seem to be the best and most appropriate way, as far as you know at the moment, to contextualize what it means to be a human being, how to make it, to help you make sense out of the human experience. But is it going to stick? So if you're just exposed to ideas and experiences, but they don't stick, nothing happens. You remain unchanged. But you did experience something, you did see something that you realized was important, but if it doesn't stick, then you won't change as a result. And what's what happens is that exactly what happens is a lot of people get exposed to these kinds of experiences, these higher states of consciousness, where they experience liberation itself in higher states of consciousness beyond ego. They get exposed to big ideas, and they see and recognize the personal and cultural significance of big ideas in terms of how through the lens of these big ideas we can actually create a different world together, a different future. But and that's very exhilarating to see, because most people don't even know how we're going to get out of the mess we're in. But once you actually see it, you say, well, this is exactly how we do it. This is the way forward. And if it doesn't stick, if it's not taken on board, then what happens is nothing happens. There's no result. Someone has a spiritual episode and moments of intellectual and philosophical clarity, but the spiritual episodes of the philosophical or intellectual clarity do not result in any kind of demonstrable difference or transformation in the individual. Right? Story of my life. It is. So that's the issue here. A lot of people think, well, I've never had the experience you're talking about. If I just had the experience you keep talking about, this absolute thing, I don't know what you're talking about. If I had the experience, then... But a lot of people have the experience, it still doesn't matter, because it doesn't stick. Or, so I don't really understand what you're talking about. It's just so complicated. And so if I only understood it, but then often people do understand it, but it doesn't stick. So my conclusion is the reason it doesn't stick has to do with the state of the soul of the individual. And that's my personal... This is how I see it. Other people might see these things in different ways, but this is how I see it. This is how I understand it. This is how I interpret it. And then just to make this a little bit more interesting to understand how I'm working with this, we're using the word soul here in the context of an evolutionary worldview. So all the ideas we're looking at, except specifically when I'm talking about traditional enlightenment on its own terms, which I did about 3 or 4 days ago, whatever it is now. Everything I'm speaking about here, I'm contextualizing within an evolutionary worldview. So we're also understanding and interpreting what the soul is within the context of an evolutionary worldview. So, in an evolutionary worldview, everything is seen in the context of that we're part of a process that's going somewhere, that's trying to go somewhere, that's going somewhere, trying to go somewhere. And for human beings, the significance of an evolutionary worldview is that, and we'll talk more about this, is that it becomes apparent to us when we look at the objective evidence that human beings, in spite of how it seems often, are, as far as we know, the developmental leading edge of a process that had a beginning 14 billion years ago. So in all our imperfection, in all our apparent confusion and madness, and all the obvious lack of development there, and all the obvious development that still needs to happen, in all our imperfection, we are the leading edge of a process that had a beginning 14 billion years ago, which means you as an individual and I as an individual are pretty decent, not perfect, nobody's perfect, but we're a pretty decent representation of how far the universe has evolved in 14 billion years. This is what the universe has produced. You want to go see what the universe has produced? Look in the mirror. And I know it's kind of hard to believe. But the reason I can say with full confidence that this is the case is because all of you can understand a lot. You seem to be able to understand a lot of the ideas and concepts that I'm working with, and you have to be culturally very, very, very sophisticated in terms of your level of education and your level of cultural development in order to get these kinds of ideas. Otherwise, you just wouldn't understand what I was talking about. It would just be like I was saying yesterday, gibberish. But simply because you have the capacity to grasp the ideas and understand their significance, means that believe it or not, yes, you, believe it or not. I know it's hard to believe. It is hard to believe, but that's part of growing up spiritually is realizing, oh my God, me? Because we're all very well aware, even though we might not like to admit it, we're all very well aware of our imperfections. We're all very well aware of how completely crazy, insane we actually really are, right? 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 Right. Right? Anybody have trouble with that? I don't. So, but be that as it may, from an objective standpoint, not from a subjective standpoint, but from an objective standpoint, in all our imperfection and madness, we are the very leading edge of a process that began 14 billion years ago. So from an evolutionary viewpoint or orientation, what that means is that we recognize that we are the eyes and ears of the leading edge of a process that's going somewhere. And so when we embrace an evolutionary worldview, and we haven't talked about this in a lot of detail yet, because I've been talking about a lot of other things, but nevertheless, what you realize is that our highly evolved capacity for consciousness, cognition, self-reflectivity at this very high level of cultural development means that, very simply, that the evolving universe only gets to become self-conscious, self-aware through the highly evolved consciousness and cognition, capacity for subjectivity and interiority of the highly evolved human being, which is you and me. And so the significance here, is that you realize that you are the eyes and the ears of the leading edge of a process that had a beginning 14 billion years ago. So you're the eyes and the ears of a process that had a beginning 14 billion years ago. And so, in the context of evolutionary spirituality and evolutionary enlightenment, the big issue is here, can I handle that? Can I bear the truth of that? Do I have the moral courage and fortitude to have the spiritual strength and spiritual self-confidence to be able to take that rather challenging truth on board? Or am I just going to say, well, that's really exciting, and just forget about it, and fall back into the world of the personal, of the psychological world, of the separate narcissistic self, and carry on? Because if you are the eyes and the eyes, ears, heart, and mind of the leading edge of a process that had a beginning 14 billion years ago, you have to reorient your sense of identity, your sense of purpose, your sense of priorities in relationship to that overwhelming fact, that overwhelming truth. And only if you have the moral courage, the moral fortitude, the spiritual strength to take it on board are you going to actually do that. Otherwise you say, oh, that's amazing, that's thrilling, and then you're going to sink back down into the very narrow world of the psychological self. Right? We're talking about, in an evolutionary context, we're talking about a nothing less than a profound, dramatic shift of identity of who I really am. You follow?